She looked me in the eye and said, "You were never part of this family. Not after 15 years of marriage. Not after I cooked her holiday dinners. Not after I cleaned up her husband's funeral in silence while everyone else wept. I was the one who stayed home while the rest of them chased promotions and posted Christmas cards with their perfect lives. I was the one she mocked to her friends. The one who wasn't good enough for her son. The one she made sleep in the guest room after fights that weren't even mine. And yet, when her body failed and everyone disappeared, she called my name. Funny how sickness doesn't care who you once disowned. The first time she ignored me at the dinner table, I thought maybe she was just tired. Margaret, my mother-in-law, had a sharp tongue, but I chalked it up to her old-fashioned ways. She'd been widowed young, raised 2 sons alone, and made it known that she didn't have much patience for anything that wasn't done her way. Still, I was raised to be respectful, so I called her Mom. Even though she never called me daughter, I folded napkins into triangles the way she liked. I mashed the potatoes smooth because she said lumps were lazy cooking. And when Jonathan and I moved into the guest room, just until we saved up, I smiled and unpacked my suitcase like it was a honeymoon. Not a trap. That just until turned into 3 years. Margaret didn't like that I was a nurse, said it made me smell like hospitals. When I came home after 12-hour shifts, she'd wrinkle her nose and say, "At least take your shoes off before you bring all that death into my house." And Jonathan, he just shrugged, said she didn't mean it, said she was set in her ways, but I noticed how she never spoke that way to her other daughter-in-law. Melanie got holiday invitations and birthday brunches and family portraits over the fireplace. I got cold mashed potatoes reheated in the microwave and the silent treatment if I forgot to refill her creamer. Once, during a 4th of July picnic, she told me I held forks wrong. I laughed, thought she was kidding, but she didn't even smile. Just muttered, "No wonder your mother didn't raise you right." That one stung, but I still passed her the potato salad, because that's what you do, right? You keep peace. You say thank you even when no one's thanked you in years. You clean up the party, you fold the chairs, you stack the Tupperware, and you pretend your name isn't being whispered in judgment from across the lawn. Jonathan didn't see it, or maybe he chose not to. He wasn't cruel. He just floated somewhere above it all. When I told him I felt invisible in his mother's house, he said, "You're overthinking again." When I said I felt like a tenant, not a wife, he kissed my forehead and went back to his emails. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that one day Margaret would soften, that she'd say something kind, maybe even accidental, that I'd come home to the smell of stew and a place at the table that didn't feel borrowed. But then came the night she locked the pantry. I got home late from a shift, starving, feet aching, only to find a padlock on the cabinet door, a bright pink Post-it note stuck to the wood. "If you're not paying for it, don't touch it." She had signed her name like it was a contract. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at that little square of paper like it might burst into flames. Jonathan was asleep upstairs. I could have woken him, could have demanded he take it off, say something, do something, but I didn't. Instead, I quietly boiled water, made a cup of instant ramen I'd hidden behind the fridge, and ate standing over the sink. That was the night something shifted in me. I stopped calling her Mom. I stopped setting the table for 3. I stopped folding her laundry with lavender dryer sheets and ironing the collars she never thanked me for. I started to come home later. I picked up overtime shifts. I listened to podcasts about boundaries and resentment and emotional labor. And every single word felt like it had been written by someone who had lived in my skin. Still, I stayed, not because I loved her, but because I loved the version of Jonathan I used to believe in, because I thought that maybe, just maybe, if I was good enough, patient enough, quiet enough, she'd finally see me. But that moment never came, not until the night her stroke dropped her onto the bathroom floor. And no one else was home. I heard the crash just after midnight. At first, I thought it was the cat. We didn't have one. But in a house where no one said goodnight, It was easier to blame ghosts than people. I wrapped my robe tighter and stepped into the hallway. The light was on in the downstairs bathroom. The door was half open, and there she was. Margaret lay on the cold tile. One arm curled beneath her. The other stretched out like she'd tried to catch herself too late. Her face was pale. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. A wet towel was crumpled beside her. I didn't hesitate. I dropped to my knees and checked her pulse thready. Weak, but there. Her pupils sluggish. I knew what this was. I'd seen it 100 times in the ER. She was having a stroke. And I was the only one there. Jonathan was out of town for work, of course he was. Melanie. She never stayed past dessert, let alone overnight. The neighbors. They'd already stopped asking how she was years ago. So it was just me and the woman who'd once said I was just a nurse, like it was an insult. I called 911. My voice was calm, clinical. I gave her birth date, her blood pressure meds, her history. I told them she was still conscious, but fading. And then I sat there, holding her hand, while she stared at the ceiling like it might give her permission to leave. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything. The paramedics arrived within minutes. I rode in the ambulance, answering every question before they asked. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't speak unless I had to. It was all instinct, reflex, training. At the hospital, I waited. They put her in a private room. She was stable, but weak on her left side. Her speech was slurred. The doctor said it wasn't massive, but recovery would be slow, especially without family support. I blinked. Family? Jonathan arrived the next afternoon. He hugged me like nothing had happened, like he hadn't left me alone in a house full of silence for years. I flew back as soon as I could. He said, breathless, "How is she? She's alive." I said. He nodded. Like that made us square. Melanie sent flowers. Margaret stayed quiet. The days blurred into one another. I took leave from work. I cleaned her room, fed her soft foods, tracked her medications. I bathed her gently. Even when she hissed in frustration, she couldn't speak much, but her eyes followed me everywhere. There was no apology in them, but there wasn't contempt either, just something tired. Once, as I was brushing her hair, she winced and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was weak, trembling. "I'm sorry," I said, thinking I'd tugged too hard. She shook her head. Her lips moved. It took her nearly 30 seconds to form the words. "No, me." I paused. "You." She nodded. Her eyes watered. I finished brushing her hair and said nothing, because I didn't know what to do with that. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way I had been. Not in the way that burns. What I felt now was heavier, like walking with wet clothes, like carrying history. The irony didn't escape me. She spent years reminding me I wasn't family. Now I was the only one who knew how to help her use a bedpan without shame. The only one who sat through every awkward silence and every failed sentence. The only one who stayed. And I wasn't staying for her. I was staying for me. Not because I forgave her, but because I refused to become her. Because someone had to break the cycle. Because I didn't want to leave this world bitter, clinging to rules about who belongs and who doesn't. So I tucked the blanket under her feet. I dimmed the lights, and I stayed. Long after everyone else had gone, the mornings were the hardest. Not because of the lifting, or the medications, or the feedings I was used to that. It was the way she watched me while I made her coffee. Her eyes were different now. Not soft, not grateful, just aware. Before the stroke, she never looked at me unless she had a complaint in hand or judgment on her tongue. But now, she tracked every move I made like she was cataloging it, measuring me against the woman she thought I was, and maybe realizing she'd never really known me at all. The words came back slowly. They always do. In pieces. First, single sounds, then yes and no. Then one morning, she rasped, "Clara," like it hurt to say. I didn't respond right away. Not out of spite, out of shock. It was the first time she'd said my name like it belonged to me. I'd always been she or her or the girl, or worse, that nurse you married. But now, it was my name, my whole name. I turned around and said, "Good morning." She didn't say anything else, just nodded. That was the beginning. After that, things changed, not quickly, not dramatically, but enough. She started responding when I asked questions, started nodding when I offered food, started allowing me to hold her hand during physical therapy, even though I knew she hated the idea of being seen as weak. One night, I walked in to find her awake. Staring out the window, she didn't speak, but she patted the chair next to her bed. So I sat. We didn't talk, just sat. The house was quiet. Jonathan had gone back to work, he called occasionally, but never stayed on the line long. Melanie sent another fruit basket. I started ignoring the group texts. They all said the same thing, "Hope she's doing okay." Not one asked how I was, but she did. One afternoon, she looked at me, her voice still fragile, and whispered, "Tired." I almost laughed. It was the first time she'd asked me anything personal in 15 years. "A little," I said, "but I've been through worse." She stared at me a long time, then said, slowly, "You? Strong." That one cracked something open in my chest. Not because I needed her praise, but because I never thought I'd hear it from her. Not ever. The next day, I found a small box in the closet while looking for her slippers. Inside were photos, old ones, some of Jonathan, some of his brother, but a few of her, before she was bitter, before life had turned her hard. There was one of her in a hospital bed, holding a newborn. A nurse stood beside her, gently adjusting a pillow. On the back of the photo, in faint pencil, she'd written, "The only woman who touched me without making me feel like a burden." I stared at that line for a long time, because I realized in that moment maybe she never hated me. Maybe she hated what I reminded her of: dependence, vulnerability, the version of herself she'd buried so deeply she didn't recognize it when it showed up again, wearing scrubs and calling her ma. That night, I told her I found the photo. She looked away, embarrassed, but I didn't press. I just said, "She must have been kind." Margaret blinked hard, then nodded. Later, as I was tucking her in, she whispered something I almost didn't catch. "Sorry took so long." I paused, then said, "Better late than never." She smiled barely, but it was real. I turned off the light and sat by her bed in the dark, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, the hum of the oxygen machine. And for the first time in all the years I'd lived in that house, it felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not as a guest, not as the help, but as a human being who mattered. By the 3rd month of recovery, Margaret could stand with help and say full sentences, short, strained ones, but sentences. Nonetheless, she hated being dependent. I could see it in the tight way she held her mouth, the quiet curses she mumbled when her hand trembled holding a spoon. But she never asked for anyone else. Not once. Not even Jonathan. He visited on weekends, brought her soft scarves, and sat in the corner like a child afraid to break something fragile. She'd nod at him, smile, sometimes. But when it came to the hard stuff, the sponge baths, the transfers, the rough moments, he disappeared back to the city. "You're better at this," he'd say. He wasn't wrong, but that didn't make it right. One Sunday evening, after Jonathan left, she asked me to sit on the porch with her. She used her walker now, and it took us almost 10 minutes to get her to the chair. But she was determined. We sat in silence, listening to crickets in the yard and a neighbor's dog barking at nothing. "Do you hate me?" she asked suddenly. I looked at her. not shocked by the question, just by the fact that she finally said it. I did, I answered. Quietly. She nodded. I deserved it. I didn't argue. You made me feel like I was invisible. I added, and I let you. She swallowed hard, her throat working around the words she hadn't said for years. I was cruel, she said. There was no deflecting, no excuses, just 3 plain words that landed heavier than any scream ever could. I think I reminded you of something you hated. I said, needing help, feeling weak. She turned her head slowly. I grew up with nothing, married a man who made me feel smaller. I fought so hard to survive. I didn't know how to welcome someone who was soft. I didn't know what to say to that, because it made sense. Too much sense. But I watched you, she continued. All these years, I just didn't know how to love someone like you. The words pierced through me, because that was it. Wasn't it? She hadn't hated me. Not really. She had just failed to love me. I could work with that. You don't owe me anything. I told her. She shook her head. I owe you everything. She didn't cry. Margaret never cried, but her hand found mine. And for the first time, there was no stiffness in her grip, no performance, just touch, honest, human, fragile. We sat there for a long time. When we went inside, she asked if I could stay in the room with her that night, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted the silence to be shared. Later, as she drifted off, she whispered, "Thank you for not becoming like me." I didn't answer, because I didn't need to. I had already made peace with who I was, not because she finally saw it, but because I had stopped needing her to. I had stopped living for the version of myself I thought might one day be enough. Enough to be called family. Enough to be loved without conditions. Enough to sit at a table and not wonder if I'd earned my place. In caring for her, I hadn't become smaller. I had become clearer. And she saw that now. That was enough. Maybe more than enough. Margaret passed away on a Tuesday morning. It was quiet. Like most endings are. She'd been weaker for days, barely touching her food, slipping in and out of sleep. Her breathing had changed overnight, shallower, more ragged. I knew the signs. I'd seen it 100 times with patients. But this time, it was different. This time, I held her hand until the last breath left her chest. She didn't speak that morning, didn't say goodbye. But the night before, she had whispered one final thing. You made this house a home, even when I didn't let you. That was the last gift she gave me. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just truth. Jonathan arrived a few hours later. He hugged me tighter than he had in years. But the silence between us felt heavier than ever. I let him have his grief. I let him cry. I didn't tell him about the conversations he missed, or the evenings she asked for me by name. I didn't need to. He'd made his choices. So had I. The funeral was small. Margaret didn't have many close friends left. Melanie showed up in black chiffon and too much perfume, clutched my hand and said, "You were so good to her." I just nodded. Afterward, the lawyer handed me a sealed envelope, Margaret's handwriting on the front. Inside was a letter and the deed to the house. She had left it to me, not to Jonathan, not to her son, not to the family name she guarded so tightly for so long. To me. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with it. The house held too much silence, too many cold winters, too many rooms that never welcomed me until she could no longer walk through them. But I couldn't sell it. That felt too final, too transactional. So I kept it, not for sentiment, for purpose. 6 months later, I turned it into a transitional home for elderly women who had nowhere else to go. Women who'd been left behind, forgotten, mistreated, or simply grown old, with no one left to hold their hand. I named it the Jennings House, not after her, not really, but after all the women like her hard-edged, scared, proud, and tired. Women who needed to be seen as people, not burdens. When I told Jonathan, he cried, not because of the house, but because he realized too late that the woman he married had built something out of what nearly broke her. Sometimes I sit on the front porch with one of the residents, drinking tea. They tell me stories, some sweet, some heartbreaking, and I listen, like I wish someone had listened to me years ago. I no longer wear my silence like armor. I no longer call myself invisible. I am not a daughter-in-law. I am not just a nurse. I am not a guest in anyone's story. I am Clara, and I stayed, not because I was weak, not because I had to, but because I knew who I was and who I refused to become. That's what Margaret gave me in the end, not love, maybe, but clarity. And in return, I gave her peace, even if she didn't know how to ask for it. Sometimes, the ones who hurt us most don't do it out of hatred, but out of fear of vulnerability, of being forgotten, of losing control. Clara's story reminds us that family isn't just about blood or marriage certificates. It's about presence, dignity, and choice. She was never truly welcomed, never truly embraced. And yet, when the time came, she chose to stay, not for approval, not for praise, but because she refused to let bitterness define her. That's the quiet power of kindness. It doesn't erase pain, but it transforms it into something meaningful. If you've ever been the one who showed up when no one else did, if you've ever been seen too late, or not at all, you are not alone. Your story matters. Your heart matters. We'd love to hear from you. Has someone in your life ever made you feel invisible? Or did you choose to be the bigger person, even when no one thanked you? Share your experience in the comments. Let your voice be heard. And if this story touched something in you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more true stories about the strength it takes to keep loving in a world that often forgets how.